Hello everyone and welcome to our Week 10 seminar. In this session, we will explore specific pedagogical frameworks in more depth, and we're going to relate them to early years, primary and secondary practice. So we're going to have a look at some specific examples. But to successfully complete the case study this week, which is directly related to pedagogy, you're going to need to understand the role of pedagogical frameworks. So we're going to break this down in the session today. A pedagogical framework, it creates the structure around the philosophy of learning and teaching that underpins our teaching practice in individual learning environments. It is a consistent and commonly shared approach used throughout the learning community. Pedagogical frameworks can be co-constructed by members of the teaching team, and sometimes in learning environments, they can be done with the involvement of children and students. So as a requirement of the Department of Education, each educational setting that you will come across during your placement will have a pedagogical framework that underpins their practice. So on the slide, we've got some examples from 4 different learning environments. So all will look differently as these ones do, but they will have clear commonalities when you look at them in detail, when you unpack them. Generally, each state has a model that defines what high quality teaching looks like in each primary and secondary setting. So it's not a prescription for practice, rather a flexible model that can be readily modified for different school settings and learning areas. Generally, schools, they will take the lead in adapting the pedagogical model for their own school context, so with an aim to improve learning outcomes through a concerted focus on students' needs, interests and abilities. So if you were to look very closely at these 4 examples, they're all very, very different and based generally on the context. So regional directors and school leaders, they work together to develop a specific framework that reflects the local community, this context. In early years settings, pedagogical frameworks, they're based around the principles of the Early Years Learning Framework and the Queensland Curriculum Guidelines. And if we look at the example on the slide, the Creation Kindergarten Association, it also incorporates a specific C&K curriculum approach, so listening and learning together, which has replaced building waterfalls recently. On the slide, you can also see an example from Orange Public School, Mansfield State School, and Corinda State High School. So we're going to unpack a couple of these over the next few slides. At Orange Public School, for example, this was a pilot school for the 8 Ways framework. So school leaders and local Aboriginal community members organised Aboriginal ways of learning into a learning cycle to inform their curriculum planning. Orange Public School has an active Aboriginal Education Committee consisting of 9 teachers across all grades, as well as various parents and community members. They hold yarn-ups once a term where the community and committee members come together to discuss the issues facing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community members and how the community can work together to close the gap. So the framework isn't stagnant. It's an ongoing process of adaptation according to needs at specific times and for individual stakeholders. So this is a pedagogical framework that allows teachers to include Aboriginal perspectives. So by using Aboriginal learning techniques, In this way, focus can remain on core curriculum content while embedding Aboriginal perspectives into every lesson. So if we break it down further, this pedagogical framework supports teachers in including Indigenous perspectives by utilising Aboriginal learning principles. In this way, focus can remain on core curriculum content while embedding these perspectives in every lesson. So, with an emphasis on identifying similarities between Indigenous and mainstream pedagogies. So, for example, collaborative practice and the focus on being child and student centred. So, these have similarities. In developing the framework, it was contended that Aboriginal perspectives don't come from Indigenised content, but from Indigenous processes of learning and knowing. So with emphasis on narrative-driven learning, on land and place-based learning, and of course, connectedness to community. So if we look at the framework, using strategies and approaches to do things like connect and collaborate through shared stories, picturing pathways of knowledge, thinking, acting, making and sharing without words, keeping and sharing knowledge with art and objects, working with lessons from land and nature, so place-based pedagogies, putting different ideas together to create new knowledge, so critical pedagogies here, working from wholes to parts, watching and then doing. So this is an example of explicit instruction, as we observed in the clip last week, and bringing new knowledge home to help their mob. So this would involve caring pedagogies. This is a really good example of how different pedagogies are interwoven with philosophical considerations and also with teaching preferences and learning and values, informing and motivating teachers' innovative practice. Pedagogical frameworks are underpinned by theory based on educational research, and we've discussed this previously. The Early Years Learning Framework, for example, it outlines best practice and reflects contemporary early childhood research and theory. So sociocultural perspectives, for example, they grew from research from seminal psychologist Lev Vygotsky, which values the social nature of learning and the importance of children as teachers of others. Or another example, in Queensland schools, many frameworks are influenced by Mazzano's art and science of teaching theory, ASOT, and Fisher and Frey's gradual release of responsibility. So just to break it down, the ASOT, the Mazzano framework, it's organised into 4 domains that we can see on the slide: classroom strategies, behaviours, preparing and planning, reflecting on teaching, and collegiality and professionalism. So a lot of schools use this as part of their framework, or at least use it in part. So 10 design questions are then provided to define teachers' actions and to plan and focus on professional development. So no doubt you will come across ASOT approaches during placement. And as I say, it may not be as a whole. Some schools will just use it in part. So looking at one of the examples from the previous slide, underpinning Corinda State High School's pedagogical framework, again, is Mazzano's ASOT, providing clear learning goals and rubrics, also including Hattie's visible learning, Fisher and Frey's gradual release of responsibility, And in terms of assessment, Williams' embedding of formative assessment. I provided a link here for you to have a look at the document to see how they've aligned pedagogy and curriculum. I think this is a really good example. So this is the kind of document that you would be looking at in your teaching setting when you go on placement. So it's something that you would discuss with your supervising teacher. You would need to develop a critical understanding of the pedagogical processes and approaches that they've utilised. This will be very important to do in your lead-in day. Pedagogical frameworks, they're used to shape the approaches and strategies used by educators. We've already defined this. So they also enable teachers to reflect and refine these practices, so both individually and collaboratively over time. So as I said before, they're not stagnant. So defined frameworks are used over the whole setting or school, so consistently, so across babies, toddlers and kindergarten in childcare centres, for example, and across prep to year 12 in primary and secondary settings. So they're not just for individual grades or classes, it's across the entire setting. Assessment for learning is linked to clear learning objectives and also to success criteria, feedback, reporting and evaluation. And importantly, frameworks are also linked to judgments around the quality of teaching and planning. So this is seen in how they are judged by regulatory bodies, and we'll have a look at this next. So if we look at the 8 ways of Aboriginal learning framework, you can see on the slide examples of how this framework is used in practice with the learning experience, the experiences within each of the 8 interconnected pedagogies involving things like narrative-driven learning, visualized learning plans, hands-on reflective techniques, the use of symbols and metaphors, land-based learning, indirect and synergistic logic, modelled and scaffolded genre mastery, and connectedness to community. So this is how they would actually use this in practice. So they're using the My Place book as an example, so for a literacy task. So this is how the actual learning framework is embedded in practice. So in terms of judgments about practice, the Early Years Learning Framework is our nationally approved learning framework in early childhood, so which outlines pedagogical practices that of course support and promote children's learning. So the National Quality Framework, it outlines the 7 national quality standards which set the national benchmark for early childhood education and care, and also outside school hours care services within Australia. So early years education and care settings are assessed and rated by ASIQA against the national quality standards. And so each setting is given a rating for each of the 7 quality areas, and a rating, an overall rating based on these results. So pedagogy, as the ELP uses it, is about the connections between relationships, curriculums, decision-making, and teaching and learning strategies. So the word pedagogy in this context, it reminds educators of the centrality of relationships for learning and care. So these are all within those national quality standards. So it's all part of the assessment and rating process by that regulatory authority. So the aim of Quality Area 1, for example, of the National Quality Standard, is to ensure that the educational program and practice is stimulating and engaging, and that it enhances children's learning and development. So curriculum decision making is key here, as it contributes to each child's learning and developmental outcomes in relation to things like their identity, connection with community, well-being, confidence as learners, and effectiveness as communicators. So it's directly related to the early years learning framework. So on the slide, you can see in the two planning examples where links have been made to the early years learning framework outcomes. So to pedagogical approaches, reflection and evaluation of teaching and learning, and of course to differentiation for individual children based on the prior observations. So if we pull these examples apart, we can see connections to the Quality Area 1. I'll give you a moment to have a look at that in detail. So as we saw in the previous planning examples, pre-service teacher will use setting and school pedagogical frameworks as the basis of observations and reflections. So as a pre-service teacher on placement, you'll be expected to understand and follow school or setting pedagogical frameworks when planning and implementing learning experiences. You would also use the language of the pedagogical frameworks in professional conversations. So this would be with your supervising teachers and of course any other teachers that you interact with. Finally, you would use the frameworks as a guide to choose appropriate approaches and strategies to support children and student learning. It's important to remember that, I guess, at uni, we can't prepare you for every teaching approach or a combination of these approaches. In each placement setting, you're going to need to develop an understanding of the approach that is adopted by the school and setting, and adapt your own approaches accordingly. So the example on the slide on this one is from Centenary State High School, where again they utilise ASOT as their pedagogical framework. So it provides them with an evidence base for the selection of teaching and learning strategies, and importantly, it gives them a common language when engaging with colleagues. So the framework is implemented in every classroom, every day. The practices, they ensure that there is a degree of consistency in the way the learning and teaching is undertaken. So it provides a foundation and theoretical framework for innovation, and also with teacher autonomy encouraged, especially in relation to the selection of strategies that enhance procedural knowledge or connect learners with the curriculum, with their peers, and with their teachers. So a number of strategies are used in Queensland schools, as I said, based on the Mazzano model and across other models as well. So to name and clarify some of these, Mazzano's research emphasises that teachers who set goals and check for understanding will be more effective in helping students achieve learning outcomes. So clarify what you want your students to learn is essential. Teachers should also give positive and constructive feedback for student progress, so helping students to see how they can improve. He also suggests that teachers should help students interact with new information, so chunking smaller sections and then checking for understanding. This is referred to as chunk and chew. You will come across this, no doubt, in your placements. Also using media, making predictions, responding in writing, or using visual representations such as graphic organisers are all recommended strategies. I guess the more engagement and ownership of the learning, the more students will retain. So learning, it must also be challenging for students, so relative to their current mastery of the topics. So there will be an expectation during placement that you will follow these school pedagogical frameworks and when you design and implement lessons. So it's important that you discuss this in depth with your supervising teacher and support your understandings and practice with research around the specific framework and the associated strategies used. So you would be observing and modelling how the framework influences the specific content area and decisions on approaches used. So this specific example from Kelvin Grove State College, it emphasises the use of the framework across subject areas. So you can see the use of learning intentions and success criteria, as well as the gradual release of responsibility that we discussed last week. So it's very clear exactly what pedagogical framework they're using here, and it would be used across all subject areas, so English, math, science, humanities, etc. So moving on to age-appropriate pedagogies, this model was introduced in response to the overuse of direct teaching or instruction in the early years of primary school. So direct instruction that is narrowly focused on the achievement of specific curriculum goals, especially those that are emphasised in national testing processes, this is an insufficient teaching method when used in isolation. So instead, teachers need to employ a repertoire of pedagogies that take into account the interests, capabilities, and characteristics of individual learners, as well as the context and purpose for their teaching. So with this in mind, the Queensland Department of Education and Training engaged researchers from Griffith University to design the Age-Appropriate Pedagogies program. So the program engaged administrators, school leaders, and researchers in working together to support prep teachers, so that early primary age group, in the use of age-appropriate pedagogies to teach the Australian curriculum. So we're going to break this down a little bit because it's something that is commonly used across early primary, but you may find it in upper primary and for some teachers in secondary as well. So age-appropriate pedagogies, they're the basis of observations and reflections. So they are currently reshaping teaching and learning in the early years of school, and I think also into the future as well. Importantly, age-appropriate pedagogies, they support early years teachers to apply a range and balance of teaching approaches and characteristics of quality teaching in their learning environments. So the characteristics of age-appropriate pedagogies represent a set of desirable qualities teachers consider when working with children and colleagues, so they're responsive to each individual child, to each context and purpose of learning. So the model identifies 11 characteristics of age-appropriate pedagogies, 3 of which are outlined on the slide. So active, agenic, collaborative, creative, explicit, language-rich and dialogic, learner-focused, narrative, playful, responsive, and scaffolded. It also identifies 7 approaches, so inquiry learning, play-based learning, project-based, explicit instruction, event-based, direct teaching or instruction, and also blended learning. So this model, it suggests that when a range of approaches and characteristics are selected and utilised, over time, then balance. Then we have a balance in teaching and learning. So again, this is something that you may come across in your placements over the next 4 years. So although age-appropriate pedagogies, although the model was introduced for early primary, as I said, it can be successfully used across all years. So this is a pre-service teacher's observation in a Year 12 learning environment, where they broke down 3 pedagogical approaches used in the lesson and the students' learning responses. So green are highlighted in positive, and the red responses were highlighted in negative. You might want to pause the slide and have a look at that in depth. So we're going to have a look at planning relating to this as well. So this example demonstrates a pre-service teacher who completed a reflection after looking in depth at a Year 6 student struggling with challenging behaviour issues. They identified varied responses to different pedagogical approaches, and they developed a goal to adapt their teaching practices accordingly. So I've highlighted some of the specific approaches that they considered and they observed in this particular reflection, this reflection of learning and teaching issues for a particular student. So on the slide, you can see the specific goals the pre-service teacher has set to support the students' learning outcomes and detailed actions to implement a collaborative learning strategy. So they've selected a specific pedagogical approach based on the observations and reflection of that individual student. So you can see how it's all connected. So the set pedagogical practices within the school, then the use of them in their observation and reflection processes, and then we can see them here in their planning. So the detailed actions to implement the specific strategies that the teacher has chosen as well. So finally, looking at, I guess, who gets to decide on the use of pedagogical frameworks? So they're influenced very much by political decisions and by government directives. Currently, the focus is very much data-driven. So this will shift and it will change with the influence of research and of course the influence of political decisions. Often the teacher will have very little say in the decision making here, especially as a beginning teacher. As I said before, you'll be following the pedagogical frameworks and approaches that are already used in the school. And this is where I guess as once you do get into professional practice, this is where our teacher representations come into play. So to be a professional teacher, you need to have an understanding of the appropriate pedagogical practices and approaches that will suit your individual students and of course their content, their context. So then to practice effectively, you need to keep up with research and to be an ongoing learner to support and also to implement change as necessary. So we're looking at teacher as change agent, teacher as professional, teacher as practitioner, teacher as researcher, and of course, importantly, teacher as learner. So there is that possibility that when you do get out into professional practice, that you will have the opportunity to have input into these pedagogical frameworks and how they are used in practice. But as a pre-service teacher, going out on placement, the most important factor to consider is to identify what the pedagogical frameworks used are and to discuss that with your supervising teacher and to base your practice on those specific frameworks and approaches. Okay, thank you very much, and I will see you in the learning forums next week.